Welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. I'm Bob Wachter, chair of the UCSF Department of Medicine. And welcome to the folks here and the folks virtually joining us. Today's a special day. This is our annual Holly Smith Visiting Professorship and visiting and lecture. Holly Smith was essentially the founding chair of the Department of Medicine here at UCSF, and I think is generally acknowledged as the person who almost single-handedly is responsible for the greatness of this department. There are a lot of kind of core principles that we still hold to that Holly gave us. Part of it is working hard but having fun, the level of kind of collaboration and collegiality, the fact that we have really three co-equal partners in the training program, the importance of all three of the missions. Those are all things that Holly brought to us, and it's nice to have an opportunity every year to remember him and his legacy. And so part of that is finding a preeminent leader in American medicine to come and spend a couple of days with us, with faculty and with the trainees, and capped by a dinner event, which will be tonight at the St. Francis Yacht Club. Holly Smith lecturers have been, and visiting professors have really been a who's who in American medicine, and we are definitely staying with that tradition today with our visiting professor, who is Carlos del Rio. Carlos is chair of the Department of Medicine at Emory and a professor of global health and epidemiology at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory. He has a number of leadership roles. It would take me too long to go through all of them, but I'll say he's chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for PEPFAR, which is the program through which we have supported AIDS and HIV activities throughout the world. An amazing success, and one, of course, that's being threatened right now. He's the immediate past president of the Infectious Disease Society of America. He's done a really groundbreaking research on access to care, patient engagement, adherence to antiretroviral therapy, prevention of HIV infection, received a number of awards, including the American Public Health Association's Award for Excellence in Public Health, and the Phoenix Award, which is the highest honor bestowed by the city of Atlanta for his service during COVID, which is really when I got to know Carlos and really admire the incredible work he did both scientifically and through his public communication. Carlos was born in Mexico City, came to Emory as a visiting medical student in 1982, and went on to be a resident and fellow in ID, and joined the faculty there, and has really spent his career there. So in addition to his amazing contributions in health and healthcare, he's really an inspiring immigrant story, so which is nice to think about at times like this. So Carlos's talk today is on Leadership 201, Lessons Learned from Leading Through Pandemics and Political Partisanship. Please welcome Carlos del Rio.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be at a Department of Medicine that I have a lot of admiration and also a lot of friends in. And when I say admiration is whenever I'm advising medical students for many years, this is a place the top ones I say you should go to UCSF, and we've had some great ones, including Colleen Kelly, who came here for residency, and now she just recently got promoted to professor with tenure at Emory when she is in her ID faculty. So it feels like, and now she's my co-director with my CFAR, so it feels like a circle gone around. And with like her, I can think of many others, Dustin Smith, Meredith Laura, and many others that I've sent here, and I will continue to send just because I think this is a superb place and superb training program. I'm very excited about the opportunity to honor Dr. Smith, and I'll start. These are my disclosures, not many. So when Bob invited me, I knew about Holly Smith. I'd never met him in person, but I wanted to do some reading on him. And you all know how long he was the chair of the Department of Medicine. He was really defining for the Department of Medicine here just as much as J. Willis Hurst was defining for the Department of Medicine at Emory. But something that I found interesting reading about his life is that his uncle, who had a significant influence in his life, trained at Rockefeller and was involved in the development of yellow fever vaccine. And it turns out that that's something we have in common, and I'll show you more later. And his father, like my father, was a lawyer. My father was not a cotton farmer, was a lawyer just like his. And he had something that is very important. He had excellent and influential mentors. And I want to to stress that, because a lot of his success, when you read about his life and you hear about him, is the mentors he had. And I would encourage people to look for those influential mentors that really make a difference in your lives. He was a member of the Harvard Society of Fellows, again, where he met a lot of very important people that were critical in his career. He served in the Army, and there he started dialysis in soldiers, and that I think was really significant. And I found fascinating to read about his wife, Margaret Smith, who actually was a spy for the CIA in the Middle East. And I think a lot of the things that you hear in his life, his have to do with that. But something really important today is he was not a Republican, but he was advisor to President Nixon. And in fact, he says that he was advisor to the three most problematic people in his times: Richard Nixon, the Shah of Iran, and Howard Hughes. So again, he went across party lines, and he really was doing it, trying to advance science. And his daughter is actually the interim chair of the Department of Medicine at University of Washington. He has some great aphorisms, as Bob said, and I pick up a few that I like. He said, "Never attribute to malice what you can attribute to incompetence." And I think that if you saw the secretary testify yesterday, that probably could apply. He said that in experiments you have to take chances, and you have to remember the Peter principle, which is many things peter out, but some pan out. And I do like that. That's a lot of science is things that don't work. And I can tell you many things that I've done in science in which have led to negative results. And negative results are frustrating, but you learn even from negative results. And also the tyranny of trivia, right? A thing not worth doing is not worth doing well. And how many times we do things that are not worth doing, and they want us to do it well. And it makes no sense to try to do well something that is not worth doing. So frequently I ask, why are we doing this? And people sometimes say, because this is what we've always done it. Well, why do we do it? And I think we need to continuously be asking those questions. But Holly Smith cared a lot about people and managed to inspire professional excellence. And I think that's really important today in our lives. But at the same time, he believed in the importance of a balanced life. And I think this work-life balance that we all talk about is something that he really cared about. But I think his two most important lessons in leadership that I took about reading from him was you have to be visible and you have to be critical. So as a leader, walk the wards. I tell our chief residents, go by the ER every day. Just show up. Just be visible. Don't be stuck in your office. You have to show up. You have to be seen, and you have to be critical. You have to look at things and really know the difference between A+ and A-. There's that big difference of what is truly excellence. But I'll end by just quoting what he said in 2017 when they asked him, what do you worry most about American medicine? And it feels like he's talking today. He said, what worries me most about academic centers is that they've gotten so big. The communication between those in the forefront of patient care, those in the front of medical advances, is not intimate. We know each other, we support each other, and we're unified as an academic community, but we're growing a lot. And when I think about Emory now has 11 hospitals. You guys just recently acquired St. Mary, St. Francis. Our clinical mission has grown, and I think we need to make an effort to continue being a community despite that big growth that we've had, and I think UCSF has done that quite well. But he also said that what's exciting about science is the way we're skipping down the DNA, and what we can do in an afternoon today, as a postdoc would have won the Nobel Prize many times in the past. And I think that's true. Science is in a place today that is nowhere close to where it was even a few years ago. And I think we should relish on that, and we should continue to advance science. So I'm going to talk about leadership. And why is leadership important? Well, it's important to the physician's work. And I quote this from a book that I recommend everybody who's interested in education reads. Molly Cook, Paul's wife, David Irby, who was the dean here, wrote this book many years ago about culture reform. And when they talk about leadership, they say in that book that physicians are expected to be leaders. So physicians ought to learn about leadership. And in fact, there's gaps in leadership skills, not knowledge, that are often ignored and lead to common problems. And I think about when I talk to our chief residents or division directors about who is your problem faculty or your problem residents, it's not that they don't know things, it's that they're not know how to lead. And knowing how to lead is really, really important in what we do. And in fact, that probably explains the difference between good and exceptional physicians, is that leadership skills. So some years ago, at the request of IDSA, they were doing a supplement of a JID about careers in infectious disease, and they asked me to write about my career. So there's an article about it that a lot of things I'm going to talk about today are in that article if you want to read the paper. So when people ask me about my leadership characteristics, and I think about the foundations of my leadership in 4 categories. And I think about family, I think about values, I think about mentors, and I think about colleagues. So I'll tell you a little bit about family. So where's my family from? Bob said I was born in Mexico. Yeah, my family's from Mexico, but really is from Cuba. And my family back as I can trace them back, they trace back to the 1600s in the port of Santa Maria in Cadiz in Spain. And around the 1680s bubonic plague that hit very significantly this town, 2/3 of the population died. And one of the survivors was a guy named Antonio del Rio, and he decided to leave Spain for new opportunities and went to the New World somewhere around 1709, 1711. That's the oldest ancestor I can find. And he settled in Cuba. And they stayed in Cuba for many generations. And if you go back and look at them, they were either physicians, pharmacists, physician or pharmacists. They were very much in the health areas until this guy, Alejandro del Rio, who was a pharmacist, but he was also a revolutionary. He was involved in the revolution for the independence of Cuba from Spain. And he was arrested and he was condemned to be died by a firing squad. And in 1872, he died in a firing squad. And his brother, who was a doctor, then rapidly left Cuba and went to Veracruz. And if you've ever been to Veracruz, it looks a lot like Cuba. They settled in Veracruz. And in fact, that's where he grew up with his son, Dr. Narciso del Rio, who had been born in Cuba, grew up there and practiced as a physician in Mexico. And then his son, which is my grandfather, Francisco del Rio, was born there, did medicine, and then went to Europe to specialize in surgery. And again, he was very involved in politics and he was a revolutionary. So when he came back from surgical training in Europe and wanted to go back to Mexico, they said, if you get off the ship, you will be arrested. So he immigrated to the US and settled in San Antonio and practiced in San Antonio. And that's where my father was born. My father was born in San Antonio, Texas. And sometimes people ask me, well, why do you speak English so well? It's because my dad grew up in San Antonio at a time that you didn't want to be Mexican or black. My dad tells me that their patients would introduce my grandfather as their Spanish doctor, not as our Mexican doctor. And my dad did not learn Spanish because you spoke English. You don't want anybody to know you were Mexican or you were an immigrant from Mexico. So when I was born, my dad spoke to me in English all the time. So it became like I learned English and Spanish at the same time. And then, in the 1940s, my grandfather left practice and entered politics, returned to Mexico and became an ambassador. And so my dad really started learning Spanish when he was about 12. And then settled in Mexico. And my mom's side, actually, they come from Ecuador. And her parents were ambassadors in Mexico when she got married to my dad, and they settled there. So why mention all this? Well, because this guy, Narciso del Rio, it turns out that he was very involved in the eradication of yellow fever in Veracruz. And in fact, this is some of the articles that I found that he's written about the eradication of yellow fever. And my dad actually had this handwritten manuscript about him describing the work he'd done in eradication of yellow fever, which I then donated to a library in Mexico. But this is some of the articles in PubMed of the things he did in eradication of yellow fever. So that's an interesting sort of symbol to Dr. Holly Smith. So as I mentioned, my dad was born in San Antonio and in the 1920s, and I was born 30 years later in Mexico City. So I grew up in Mexico City, with a small detour to a boarding school in Canada. When I was in high school, my dad decided that my English wasn't good enough, so he sent me over to 2 years of boarding school in Canada so I can perfect my written and English. But most of I grew up in Mexico, and something that influenced my life was the fact that my dad, when he was 39 years old, he was appointed Justice of the Supreme Court of Mexico. So I was a really young kid, but I grew up, therefore, in a house where justice, politics, and medicine were part of the ongoing conversations. On a daily basis, we talked about it. And I think that has influenced a lot of what I care about and I talk about. I did my medical school in Mexico, and that's where I met my now wife. But back then, I had a beard. And I think if ISIS, immigration ICE will see me today, probably get me deported. when I asked my wife if she wanted to marry me, she said yes, but take that beard away. And since then, I had never had a beard. So I came to the U.S. In 1982 as a visiting medical student to Emory through a sort of a casual event, and then went back to Mexico to do my year of social service, and then matched and entered the match. And I was very interested in matching at Emory, primarily because the chair of the Department of Medicine was Willis Hurst. And Willis Hurst is one of the great cardiologists of American medicine, the writer of the heart. And I wanted to be a cardiologist. And that's why I went to Emory. That's what I wanted to be. And as Ella saw today, I still love cardiology and I love looking at EKGs, and I still have this cardiology chip in my heart. But something happened as I was entering my second year of residency that influenced me significantly. I was traded to Johns Hopkins. I was a second year resident, and there was somebody at Hopkins that needed to come to Atlanta for personal reasons. She was pregnant. She was about to have a baby with somebody that was at Emory as an intern who had been a Hopkins medical student. And they decided that when she went to talk to her chair, she said, I'm quitting and going to Atlanta to have my baby. He said, no, you're going to Atlanta to be a resident. We'll get the people at Emory to send us somebody up here. And they sent me up there. And so I was involved in a trade, and I had no way to say no. But it changed my life. And it changed my life primarily because my first attending was John Bartlett. And all of a sudden, I returned to Emory from Hopkins, wanted to do ID. The influence of a mentor. I mean, my experience working with John Bartlett dramatically changed what I wanted to do. There was the beginning of the HIV epidemic and all those things that I was seeing really had a tremendous impact in my life. Had I not gone to Hopkins, I would probably be a cardiologist today. But that event really changed my life. Another event that changed my life significantly was in 1989. In 1989, I had been admitted to EIS, but I was in the US on a J1 visa. And it turns out CDC couldn't take me, so I was trying to figure out what to do. And Jaime Sepulveda, who many of you know, who was here at the Global Health Institute, had just returned to Mexico. He was then Assistant Secretary of Health, and he said, why don't you come work with me in the National AIDS Program? I said, okay. So I went to Mexico and became director of the National AIDS Program. And Jaime was my direct supervisor, but also I did a lot of work together with Julio Frank, who was the director of the Mexican Foundation for Health, and Julio is now the chancellor of UCLA. And one day I got a call from Fernando Zacharias, who was the director of AIDS program at Pajo, who interestingly had also been a ID fellow at Emory. And he said, there's an opportunity to get some funding from Rockefeller to do some work in Mexico. You're trying to develop a research program. Why don't you write a grant? I had never written a grant in my life. And he said, well, I know this guy who's really good at grants. Let me get you in touch with him. So he called King Holmes. And he said, I have this young guy who needs to write a grant. And can he go spend time with you? And King, in a very generous way, says, yeah. So I flew to Seattle to spend a month with King and wrote a grant. And he accepted me and helped me write this grant. Didn't know me from anybody. And again, those giving mentors that give time really change your life. So King became a mentor as a result of that collaboration and a result of that grant. And as a result of that grant and others that I got a USAID grant. I started working at the border. And because I was working at the border on HIV and TB, I met the CDC director of HIV, who happened to be Jim Kern, who later became my boss at the School of Public Health. So really, it's those connections that really impact your life in strange ways and really determine what you end up doing. So I've always was interested in public health. I never got any formal training in public health, but I got a lot of public health mentors that really shaped the way I think about public health. But in 1986, for a variety of reasons, 1984, I started to think what to do and what next I wanted to do in my career. And then, we ended up returning to Emory in November of 1986 after spending 8 years in Mexico. And my career at Emory, I kind of had it summarize it there, as many things. I've done all sorts of things, including, directed our CFAR, been in the dean's office, and now the chair of the Department of Medicine. But at Emory, I've had also very influential colleagues, and I mentioned the importance of colleagues in your life. And there have been many very influential colleagues, but three that I will highlight are three women that have been very important in my life. And my wife calls them my work wives, because they are literally people that I work with on a daily basis, and those are Wendy Armstrong, Colleen Kelly, and Nadine Rufal. They have been tremendous colleagues, and both Nadine and Colleen were my fellows. But they're also my colleagues, and they're also peer mentors, and have continued to be really important in my career and in my life. So I was appointed, my dad, became Justice of the Supreme Court at age 39. I was appointed director of the National AIDS Program in Mexico at age 32. So I have some early lessons from leadership is that age and experience matters. So you got to respect your colleagues and seek your advice. I was appointed director of the National AIDS Program when I was 32. Everybody working for me was older and had way more experience than I did. Number two is, then I later became chief of medicine at Grady. And, the guy who had been my program director, Ken Walker, now was supposed to be reporting and working for me. It was really weird and really difficult, right? And then I became chair of the Department of Global Health at Emory. And people like Stan Foster, Phil Brockman, Rochad, and Bill Fagey were my faculty. I mean, how could I tell those people what to do? I mean, they were the giants of public health. I used to tell Bill used to have lunch with me about once a month, and I used to say that was the closest I got to having lunch with the Pope. I mean, Bill is one of the geniuses of public health, and it was just great to hear his advice and learn from him. My second lesson would be that it's really important that you work harder than anyone else. This also, by the way, avoids people complaining about how much work they have to do. So get to work first and be the last to leave. And number three is that you have to create an environment where people succeed. Your job as a leader is to make others succeed, not to make yourself succeed. So over life, I've learned a lot of lessons in leadership. And the number one is that opportunities are everywhere and don't be afraid to grab them. I mean, I remember when I was told that I was being traded to Hopkins, we had just bought a house in Atlanta. My wife's question was, who's paying your salary? And, I had no idea what was going to happen. But it was a good opportunity and really led to really important things in my life. Number two is that change is part of a leader's role. You need to think about how you change things, how you proactively define the future. Don't let the future define yourself. And you need to continuously refresh your thinking and challenge conventional wisdom. I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is to say, well, this is the way we've always done it. Challenge that and think about creative ways of doing things in a better way. Again, have the best interest of others that work for you at all times, because leadership is about making the world working around you better. But it's also your responsibility to inspire and unite people. At complicated times like this one, our jobs as leaders is really to inspire people and to provide a way forward. Now, don't confuse leadership with status, power, or authority. Never underestimate the power of please and thank you. And have fun. Don't take yourself too seriously and laugh at your mistakes and enjoy your life, and don't take yourself too seriously because it's bad. So what are important competencies and leadership that I think are critical? Number one is that you have to be ethical. You have ethics at the center of everything you do. You have to create a safe and trusting environment. Again, you have to empower others. You have to foster a sense of connection and belonging. You have to show openness to new ideas, and you have to nurture growth. If you do those things, you're going to be a good leader. But leadership gets complicated when there's a crisis. And a lot of the leaders are defined at the time of crisis. So what is a crisis? A crisis is that situation that threatens the financial well-being, the operation, the reputation, the legitimacy, or the survival of an organization. And why are crises bad? Well, because there's a decline in available resources, there's job loss, the reputation of the organization suffers, there's more scrutiny outside, there's expenses go up, revenue goes down, budgets are cut, there's mistrust, there's misinformation. So crises are difficult to manage. And where did I learn from crisis? Where I learned from crisis, I started in 1994 when I was director of the National AIDS Program in Mexico, and there was a huge financial crisis in Mexico. The peso was devalued in half, inflation soared, there was a severe recession. I had to fire half of my staff. I mean, it was difficult to make anything work when you all of a sudden had half of your available resources. The second one was in 2007 when Grady had a big financial crisis, a $60 million deficit, and we couldn't keep payroll, and there was concerns that the hospital was going to have to close. And what do you do when that happens? I still remember, we were in the midst of this big crisis, and I got a call from Jay Willis Hurst, from Dr. Hurst says, so what have they asked you from the dean's office for your for your contingency plans? And I said, yes. He says, well, open the left drawer in the desk. I had his desk. Open the left drawer. I left a folder there with contingency plans and you can use. Just pull it out and give it to them. So again, leaving how to deal with crisis for the future person was an important lesson I learned from him. But then the biggest crisis started in December of 2019, when on December 7th, a joint of 27 inches broke. And this is in the mechanical room of Grady Hospital, which is between the 6th and 7th floor of the hospital. Don't ask me why the mechanical room is there. And within minutes, over 50,000 gallons of water started pouring down. And we had to start, moving patients and doing crisis mode. And it was a disaster. Elevators, did not work, et cetera. And this is just how that looked. And we thought it was, that was the worst crisis we've ever had. And then all of a sudden COVID hit, right? We had, all of a sudden COVID, right after that COVID hits. And we started hearing about this epidemic happening in Wuhan. But very shortly thereafter, by March 8th, we admitted our first patient with COVID to Grady. And over the ensuing, 3 years, we've admitted, 5,600 patients. And you can see in this graph, at some point in time, we had over 400 people hospitalized with COVID. And in some days we had, close to 400 deaths happening one day. Just think about that, what that means. And again, what do you do with bodies? What do you do with how do you manage at a hospital? What kind of crisis you're dealing with? So COVID, I think for many of us, was the biggest crisis we've ever confronted. And and one of the things that was very clear from the very beginning to me, it was that we needed communication and we needed to let people know what we were doing, what was happening. So as early as March 13th, I started having some what I call COVID town hall meetings, which was just Friday afternoon times that we got together and I updated them on epidemiology, on what was new in treatment, what was new in prevention, what we were doing. But very quickly I said, it's going to be important also to have other leaders besides me speak. So I started inviting a lot of people, and we had a lot of interesting people come in and speak. And some were very inspirational, like Tyler Perry, just saying, thank you for all you're doing. And others were, people like Tony Fauci saying, this is what is happening at the White House. This is what we're doing. This is what we're thinking in developing vaccines. But thousands of people watched them, and they were even live streaming on Facebook. And we had a huge, it's still today, sometimes I run into people at the airport said, oh, I saw all your COVID town halls. But I also thought that it was really important to have music be a part of this, because I thought that there's a component of music that is good to heal the soul, and trying to figure out a way to provide peace to people. So through my connections with the Atlanta Symphony, I'm on the board. I was able to get the musicians to send us little clips of performances, and every single one of our town halls, we had a little musical moment at the end in which we had somebody play something for us. And I think that was really quite nice and quite reassuring. Other things I did in communications is with the National Academy of Medicine and the American Public Health Association, we put together a series of webinars called COVID-19 Conversations. A total of 22 webinars were done, again, with thousands of people watching them. And if you go to the website and see who was on them, it's really like who is who in public health and in policy that participated in those webinars. So I think the communication component is something that I think we did quite well. So what is the leadership approach to crisis? There's a lot of things that leaders have to do in crisis. And I said communication is one of the most important things. But really, the key one is trust. And leaders have to build trust. And how do you build trust in a crisis? I think is really what distinguishes good leadership. So why is trust important? Well, because, first of all, you have to be reliable. You have to do what you say you're going to do. I mean, the most important thing to get people vaccinated is to say, I got vaccinated, and to show people that you got vaccinated. You have to show people what you're doing. The second is you have to be open. Right? You have to talk about trust and transparency. You obviously have to be competent, but really important is you have to show compassion. Empathy is really an important component of leadership at a time of crisis. And understanding that people are suffering and that you're offering them compassion, I think, is critically important. So leadership in crisis is really about, thinking about a personal operating model. People say, well, I work 20 hours a day. Well, that's unsustainable. You need to figure out what's going to work for me, what's going to be your routine, how are you going to survive during a crisis. Number two, you got to set your intentions. What are my goals for today? What do I want to accomplish? You have to be very careful with your reactions. You don't want to overreact. You don't want to show, that the end of the world is here. You don't want to show that we don't know what's going on. But you have to also have time to reflect, to think of, to reframe your perspectives. And again, very important to manage your energy. You don't want to burn out. The worst thing is the leader that burns out during a crisis. So, during crisis, there is fear. And as I said, transparency, truth, and constant communication are critical in getting over a crisis. And transparency, I think, is the job one of leaders during crisis. You have to be clear about what you know, about what you don't know, and what you're going to do to learn more. And, sometimes when I think about what's happening right now, people say, well, what are we going to do? And you have to say, this is what we know and this is what we don't know. And when we know more, we'll let you know, right? Thoughtful and frequent communication is critically important. And you have to take special time to listen to your audience concerns, answer their questions, address their questions. So town hall meetings in which people can participate, can openly give their concerns, I think are really important. And having members of the crisis response team speak, I think is really important. I think, one of the mistakes that I think was done in COVID is that we always had, from the White House, we always had Tony Fauci or Rochelle or somebody speak, but we rarely had the people on the front lines. And I think it's really important when you go back to, for example, the influenza pandemic when Rich Besser was director. Rich was on TV and in front of the press every day, but he would say, no, the person to answer this question is X. He would call on the experts to answer the questions. And I think this is something that, when I needed to talk about what are we doing in lab testing during my town halls, I will bring the person from the lab. He was the one to talk about tests, not me, because bring your experts into the communication, I think is really important. And again, everybody has a plan until you're hit in the mouth, right? I mean, everybody has a plan until something hits you, and then all of a sudden everybody gets. And there's something important about ID, which is during infectious disease outbreak, there's a lot of irrational behavior. Think about HIV, think about the early years of HIV, think about COVID. Every single time there is irrational behavior. And so therefore, crisis communication in infectious disease is particularly important because, one characteristic of public health crises is that surprises happen. Pathogens and people behave in unexpected ways. Things go wrong, and policies have to be changed on real time. And I think that's something that a lot of people that like to control things really get very, very concerned about. They don't want anything to go wrong. Well, guess what? Things go wrong. This is what happens with pathogens and people. And there's going to be a lot of flailing. And as I said, officials don't like that. They want to hide the flailing. And it's important that, they think this is going to hurt their reputation. And the reality is if you try to hide it, it's worse. So it's more important that you learn as you go. You learn from your mistakes. You hope the best you cope the best you can, and you move on. And there's lots of really good communicators in infectious disease that I've learned from. And I consider them my mentors and advisors in learning crisis communication. The first one is Jeff Copeland. Jeff was the director of CDC during the 2001 anthrax attacks. And he said many good things, but I love this one. He said, we're going to learn things in the coming weeks that we wish we had known when we started. And I think this is something that happens all the time. We wish we had known that masks were necessary from day one in COVID. We wish we had known X. But you learn things as you go, and you have to realize that. Number two, I think the best communicator in infectious disease is probably Rich Besser. And again, Rich, in many communications he had, I love this one. I want to acknowledge the importance of uncertainty. At the early stage of an outbreak, there's more uncertainty, and probably more than everybody would like. Our guidelines and advice are likely to be interim and fluid, subject to change as we learn more. I mean, how nice would have been somebody who said that during COVID? And then, he said the goal was to tell everything we knew and everything we didn't know. So during a crisis, you have to say what we know, but you also have to acknowledge what we don't know and what you're going to do about it. And finally, there's David Hinman, who said the famous phrase, we are building our boat and sailing at the same time. So those are three, great crisis communication leaders that I think I've learned a lot from. But I think another important component is that during a crisis, it's important for leaders to acknowledge that part of what they need to do is make a positive difference in people's lives. This requires you as a leader to acknowledge that people's and professional challenges that they're facing and during a crisis. I mean, I still remember talking to a young faculty. I said, "What's your biggest accomplishment of this year?" And this person said, I taught my son how to read. We were homeschooling, right? That was her biggest accomplishment. And so, she was trying to be an ICU attending, but she was also trying to be a mom and a at-home school mom. And she was under a lot of stress. You have to acknowledge that people are not at their normal. They're suffering. They're going through a lot of stuff. And acknowledging the humanity, I think, is a critically important of leadership. So crisis communication. I think one thing that I've learned about crisis communication is that during a crisis, you need to have a sort of a nice combination of a confident tone and tentative content. You have to sound confident, but you also need to not sound arrogant, that you know everything. You have to have that tentative content. Because otherwise people are going to say, well, 2 days ago you said this, and now you're contradicting yourself. Well, that's true. It's going to happen. And you need to acknowledge that. Because you don't know what's going to happen next. And you're going to change a bunch of policies. You're going to change a lot of things. And there's going to be a lot of screw-ups. And coping with chaos is actually one of the most important things you do as a leader during a crisis. But because you have to cope with chaos, one of the things you have to do is also don't freak out. Maybe you're freaking out, but don't show it. It's like, think about the captain of the Titanic. I'm sure he was freaking out, but you have not to show it. So what do you do during crisis communication? The number one thing is you got to get to know your communication teams. I mean, before COVID, I did not know my communication team at Emory, but the first thing I did is I called them. I said, okay, who's going to work with me? Who I need to know? What do I need to know to get communications out? What are the parameters of things I can talk about, I cannot talk about, et cetera? And number two is you have to anticipate that things are going to go wrong. And again, a lot of people that do crisis management hate things to go wrong, but the reality is things are going to go wrong during the crisis. And you have to establish a good communication system. You have to be the first one to notify when something went wrong. I mean, when we had, the first 3 people in our ER that got infected, I was the first one to come out and say that. I mean, I got a call from the CEO of the health system saying, nobody in our health system is going to get infected with COVID. I said, well, I got bad news for you. We already have 3 people. So, well, you have to acknowledge that that's going to happen, and you have to know how to work with it. You have to identify and know who your stakeholders are. And again, you need to be ready to develop. You have to have statements ready to put out. But don't play ostrich. Don't just stay giving statements. And more importantly, use a language that the audience understands, that the audience can relate to. And this goes back to the more you can use personal examples, the more you can use personal anecdotes, makes a huge difference on what people think and say. So media appearances was something that, Bob, myself, and many others did a lot of. And one of the things that I tried is not just stay in CNN or not just stay in certain media. So I actually accepted to go to Fox and go to many other places. And you have to, again, be able to cross the line and talk to different audiences. Talking to your same audience is not going to solve things. So I was lucky, as Bob mentioned, during the pandemic to be advisor to a lot of different people, the mayor of Atlanta, the mayor of Savannah, the mayor of Phoenix, but also had the opportunity to work with, with airlines, with schools, but also with the sports industry and including the NCAA and the USTA. And again, I had to talk to them about communication. I remember when we started working with Delta, I said, we need to get a communication out to passengers and to employees about what's going on with COVID. What are we doing? And initially, somebody said, really? I said, yeah, we really need to do that. And I was very happy when eventually, back in August of 2020, Delta sent this thing that said, your update from Ed and Emory, Dr. Carlos del Rio, because they sent this to all their flyers. What is Delta doing? What is our air circulation? What are we doing? How you can still fly, et cetera. But at the same time, I said, we also need to communicate our employees and our employees who speak Spanish and our employees who are in many other places around the world. So again, I did a lot of communication things with them, working on how to get the message out of the things that we're doing to mitigate this problem. There are a lot of approaches to crisis communication. And one of them that CDC uses all the time is called SOCO, which is single overriding communication objective, which that means is that it's a risk communication strategy that CDC uses, and it's basically stick to your message. And when the press asks you something, you always bring them back to your message. They say, well, how about, mask? You say, well, we are here to talk about vaccines. And somebody says, well, can we use testing and mask instead of vaccines? And you can say, well, testing and masks are good strategies, but let me tell you why vaccines are important. You take them back to what your message is. You go back to what you're trying to get across at that moment. I think the other thing we faced during COVID was the misinformation, and that to me was really new. It was really a new phenomena, and it happened very early. I mean, you can see this tweet from the director of WHO, from Dr. Tedros, saying how false information is spreading more rapidly than the virus. And I think a lot of it had to do also with Twitter and other social media platforms. This is really the first pandemic of social media, and I think that influenced a lot of what happened. So you have to learn about crisis communication in the digital age, right? And when you're doing crisis communication in the digital age, there's 5 really important tenets. One is you have to be prompt, because if not, rumors will follow, will lead. Number 2, again, go back to compassionate. If you don't deal with people's feelings first, they won't listen to you. They won't listen to the facts. Acknowledge that people are suffering. Hear the stories. You have to be honest. Don't make them feel like you're trying to, obstruct the truth. You have to give information. And it's really important that you're interactive. Digital communication is very important that you do it in an interactive way. And with a couple of other colleagues at IDSA, we wrote this paper about, how do you leverage digital strategies during a pandemic? How do you work on digital strategy during that pandemic? I think there's still a lot of research and science that can be done trying to understand the way of digital communication during a pandemic. But something that we're still struggling with, and quite frankly, we don't have the answers, are misinformation, disinformation, right? So misinformation is the information that is false, inaccurate, or misleading, according to the best available evidence at that time. And disinformation is misinformation spread intentionally with a malicious purpose. And this is not a new phenomena, but I think during this era of social media and the internet has really been amplified like never before. Because the fact is that fake news travels way faster than news, and there's a lot of polarization and there's a lot of misinformation happening. And the problem is once it gets out there, it's really hard to get rid of it. So there's a lot of manipulation, a lot of misinformation. It could be for impersonation, for conspiracy, for polarization, you name it. And we as physicians have a role in combating misinformation. We have a role to play. But as I said, it's really, really hard. And misinformation is serious. And frequently you need to find out, why is there misinformation? And I'm going to give you one example, and that is in the anti-vaccine industry. One of the biggest funders of the anti-vaccine movement is actually the wellness and nutritional supplement companies. They're big backers, big monetary backers of the anti-vaccination movements and campaigns. And anti-vaccine content reaches 58 million online followers, and it's delivery, something that creates an advertising revenue of about $1 billion. And hesitancy against one vaccine quickly goes into another. The nutrition and supplement industry is big in this because they want you to, they're getting the message out that instead of vaccine, you got to use vitamin A, or you got to do this, or you got to do that. It is, so that company is getting, that industry is getting benefits from pushing anti-vaccine messages, financial gain. So you got to think about, why is misinformation and what's backing misinformation? And the problem is we don't have the resources to fight this kind of manipulation. And as we talked about, social media is just is really where a lot of untruths are discussed there. And those of us, sometimes you get exhausted about seeing the amount of misinformation that happens in social media. And correcting it is not easy, right? The fundamental problem with misinformation is once people have heard it, they tend to believe it and act on it, and even if it's corrected. Think about autism and measles vaccine. People continue talking about that. That's been discredited over and over. And yet we're going to do a new study trying to find that association. I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense. So there's been a lot of effort trying to say, what can we do to fight misinformation? And together with Google, with Yahoo and the National Academy, they come up with some basic principles, right? About what can you do to deal with how do you identify credible sources of information? How do you make sure that you're not spreading misinformation online? So there's a lot of lessons in crisis communication that I've had during COVID. And I think one of the important ones for us is that, with very rare exceptions, media interviewing skills are not part of the training that we have as physicians or as PhDs. You know, we know how to give a talk at a conference, but that doesn't mean you can talk to the media. So if you're going to talk to the media, get training on talking to the media, because it's very different than talking, you know, like, don't throw statistics, don't throw p-values. And, you know, how do you talk to people? I think in the media, I think is really important. And I remind you what I said before is that you need to come across as compassionate, as confident, and as competent. And sometimes you're not right. And don't get in a fight, and never ever get in a fight with the media or government agencies. They are way more powerful than you, and they can crush you very quickly. It's better sometimes to just back off and don't get into a media fight. It doesn't work well. You know, in the pre-digital era, when I started as director of the National ACE program, my dad one day said to me, you know, let me give a piece of advice. He says, remember periodicals, like newspapers, they're periodical. They're here one day, they're not here the next day. If there's something in the paper about you that you don't agree with, and you respond, the next day there's an article by you, the following day there's going to be something else. If you let it die, let it die. So periodicals, but that's not the issue with social media. Things stay there, and the internet is very different nowadays. So COVID was also a time of partisanship. And to me, that was also new, right? Public health has always been political, but has rarely been partisan. You think about Ryan White, you think about a lot of things. It had frequently, you know, PEPFAR, it's been bipartisan support that has been behind it. But somehow, I don't know why, you know, confronting with a deadly pandemic that threatened millions of lives and cost millions of lives, instead of coming together as a nation, we actually came apart. And why that happened, I'm not sure we totally understand. But it was very clear that political affiliation and political ideology started to run what people believed. And, you know, there's a lot of examples, but Republican support for mitigation measures, perception of severity of COVID, and support for vaccines has decreased over time about the outbreak. And to me, it's even interesting today to see how the Trump administration is almost trying to not even acknowledge Operation Warp Speed, which to me was like an incredible accomplishment of Trump 1 and something he should be recognized for. But somehow now is like, oh, I'm not sure would that ever happen. You know, we're trying to rewrite history, and it's absolutely false. I mean, that was one of the best accomplishments, right? And so how do we get away from partisanship? I think it's going to be really, I don't think we have the answer to this. And how do we get rid of partisanship as something that's driving where we are in politics? Because that's what's driving our divisions right now in science and public health, and our perceptions of the trust we have in what we do. And we need to end that. And how we do it, I think, is going to require a very different leadership. So in conclusion, I would say that communication, to me, is a critical part of the crisis response. Always think about a positive framing in your communication. And I love, you know, trust is at the center of communication. And I tell people that when you're communication during a crisis, you have to be a rock. You have to be reliable, you have to be open, you have to be compassionate, and you have to be kind. And if you're a rock, you're going to be a good communicator. So I'll tell you about my personal lessons. During a crisis, keep learning, keep asking questions. Realize that you need to keep pushing forward. You need to take risk. You need to realize that mistakes will be made, and you have to have a culture that embraces mistakes. Crisis leadership is much more than simply leading an organization through a response to a crisis. Pause, reflect on what you've done, and always keep people's well-being at first. and be humble. When people ask me what is the most important lesson you learned from COVID, is to be humble and to use the words "I don't know" when you ask a question, because frequently that's what you need to answer is "I don't know." But I'll end by quoting Winston Churchill, who said, "It's no use of saying we're doing our best. You have got to succeed in doing what's necessary." And I think that is a very important lesson, is that sometimes what you have to do may be painful, but what needs to be done is what has to be done. So why do I attribute my success? Well, in summary, I attribute my success to excellent mentors, to network with great collaborators, to opportunities and during my lifetime, to persistence, never be afraid of failure, and also to having a very supportive wife who I've been a collaborator with, who's also a darn good writer. She just recently published a book on pathology of infectious disease that I would have never been able to put together the way she did. And yes, we lived in Atlanta for 3 decades, and during those 3 decades, we moved to Atlanta when our kids were, 5 and 8, but they grew up, they went to college, and now they are married, and they have a total of 5. I have a total of 5 grandchildren. And at the end of the day, go back to family and go back to your values, because at the end of the day, that's what you're going to be remembered. That's what you're going to be your legacy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. That was terrific and inspiring. Why do you think you were chosen to be traded to Hopkins? Was it because you were an immigrant?
It's interesting. Yeah, I think they probably realized that I would be the one that did not say no. I think they figured out that I wouldn't be the one that would not say no, because I know they asked somebody else before me who said no.
Wow. You didn't talk much about the current crisis and the one that we're now facing, and sort of politically generated. How are you managing that? How's that different than the way you manage COVID? And I'm particularly interested, there's the old never let a crisis go to waste. Are there things that you think are opportunities in the current crisis? Because I think we're all in the middle of trying to figure out how to manage this.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping to talk about that this evening, but I can do a brief. I think managing. I think more than managing in a crisis right now, we're really managing uncertainty, and it's uncertainty that I think, to me, it's what makes it even more complicated, because it's not just the crisis; it's uncertainty. It's. I was telling somebody yesterday that I think about, one thing would be to have an earthquake or to have a hurricane. It happens, there's damage, and then you know how to move forward. But here's there's ongoing aftershocks on a continuous basis. So we don't know where the floor is. We don't know where this is going to end. And therefore, what we may plan may not be sufficient. What I plan to do today may be too short to what is needed in the future. I was talking to my administrator today about, doing some support from some people who lost grants. And he said, well, how about if we model this over the next year? If more people lose grants, where are we going to be? Are we going to be able to support in the future what we're supporting today? And the answer is no. So are we not doing it today because we can't do it in the future? Or we do it today and say we can't do it in the future? I mean, those are the kinds of decisions that you have to take. So one of them is it's almost like going to rapids, trying to stabilize things on a day-to-day basis and trying to think about what are the challenges that I have today, but at the same time, trying to keep our mission at the center of what we're doing, and trying to think about, what are our missions, our patient care, teaching, and education, and research, and how do we try to preserve those and excel in those, and what are the opportunities that we have to do, some consolidation and some, looking at some of our research expenses, I tell you, we can go through some serious lean process, right? Because we have grown our research administration infrastructure in ways that probably don't make any sense. And this is a good time to really rethink about what we're doing and the 20 different committees we have to get approvals, et cetera. So I think there's opportunities to cut some costs in areas that in the past we were throwing money. I don't know here, but at Emory, sometimes I think that when we see a problem, we tend to throw people at it as opposed to fixing the problem. And by adding more people into things, you just create more barriers, quite frankly, as opposed to making things faster. So thinking about a lean approach to some of the processes that we have that have grown in expense over the past years, to me, is one of the things that we're doing internally in the department.
That That never happens here. Allison, do you want to? People have questions here, and then if there are any online, we'll take questions. Any questions or comments here? Paul, say who you are.
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul Volberning. Hi, Carlos. This is a off-the-wall question, but you're presumably a dual citizen. You say things very publicly. You say things that are critical sometimes of the power establishment. Are you personally afraid at all?
Yeah, no, I am. I think my wife is more afraid. My wife says, you know, one day you're going to travel, we're going to travel international, and they're not going to let you back into the country. and she may be right, but at the same time, I think you have to speak truth to power, and you have to be very clear. I don't want to be political, and I have worked across party lines many times in the past, and with the previous Trump administration, I worked in a lot of things, including, you know, I worked with Tony in putting the End the HIV Epidemic initiative. I still remember when I was telling my research team, you have to listen, you know, in February of 2019, I said, you have to listen to the State of the Union tonight, because I knew he was going to announce the End the HIV Epidemic, and they were looking at me saying, why do you want to torture us by watching I said, no, you really have to watch it. It's going to be important, you know. But, you know, I work a lot with Brent Gerard and advancing some of the integration of ID and opioid use disorder. So I think we need to be able to work with different people, but also we need to be very clear of what is truth and what is not. And I think we need to speak out with truth and science and reality and do it in an effective way. And, you know, yeah, there are clearly risks, but I'll go back to my father. I still have a lot of trust in justice, and I think that justice will prevail. And I think that you're not doing anything illegal by exerting your First Amendment right, and you should be able to continue speaking truth.
Right. Other? All the way in the back. Hang on one second.
Thank you for your talk, and also the Mike Tyson quote reference of everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face. In terms of that and being able to accept losing, how much of a role have you seen ego play in leaders being able to admit that they're wrong or haven't gotten things correct or having to take a step back and reevaluate things publicly?
You know, I think, yeah, there's a role of ego, but I also think there's a role of the people advising leaders, of saying, you know, don't admit. And one of the things that I think I learned early on as a leader when I was in the National AIDS program, I had a deputy that was very frank with me, and in English. He also spoke English very well. Like, we would be at a meeting and I would say a couple of things, and then, you know, he would never criticize me in public, but then we would go back to my office, he would close the door and he said, "Can I speak frankly, sir?" And I think you need to have somebody who's willing to tell you the truth close to you. And I think as a leader, it's really important to have somebody close to you that you can trust, that can speak truth to power. Because the worst thing that can happen as a leader is everybody tells you everything you're doing is great. And the reality is you're making mistakes. Having somebody that has the guts and the confidence to tell you that, I think, is really important as a leader, to have that dissenter, that person that really keeps you grounded in that you are making mistakes and you need to acknowledge them.
Time for one more. Ella? Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was a great talk. I think something I'm really struck by is this kind of balance between communicating uncertainty, something we're very used to, and then how mistruths and misinformation is often spoken or expressed in very certain terms. And so as public health communicators, how do you recommend we deal with that? Acknowledging uncertainty, acknowledging what we don't know, and then also telling people who are so sure that they are not sure. And do you think that the trust in the the public health establishment is beyond repair, or is there a hope for the leaders of the future?
So I'll start with the last part. I hope that there's a possibility that more truth will prevail, but we need to also explain to people what we do. I think the lack of science literacy and the lack of understanding what happened during COVID, I think for the first time we saw the sausage being made, right? I mean, those of us doing science are comfortable with the scientific method and are comfortable with the errors and are comfortable with null hypothesis. I think the general public thinks that, you're going to appear out there and say, this is the reality, this is the way forward. And when the people doing misinformation say, this is what needs to happen, and you sound tentative, you sound like you don't know what you're doing. So I think we need to also get people to understand that science is fluid, and that when we reassess and reevaluate and change recommendations, is not because we were wrong, it's because we know more facts than we did before. And I think that's so difficult to get across to people, right? To explain to them that with the knowledge we now have, our recommendation changes. And that is frequently translated into, well, you lied to me before. And that is something that we somehow need to teach at a very young age to understand. And people that, do simple experiments understand that, but getting people to make that part of their life, I think, is very hard. And people internally want leaders that tell them this is the truth and this is what you need to do. So when we as scientists talk, we also need to be sure that when we talk with a tentative content, we don't make it sound like we don't know what we're talking about. So it's that very difficult balance between telling the truth, telling what we know, but also acknowledging what we don't know. But I think the third step there is saying, what are we doing to know what we know, and when are we going to let you know what happened?
I like authoritative uncertainty. Carlos, that was terrific. Thank you for being here, and hope to see many of you tonight.